Everybody, what's up? Welcome to Idealism Forever, where once you go conscious, you never go back. And as we all know, that's because we're a community of immortal spirits, as we all know, of course. Well, anyway, today I'm going to be addressing a paper by a philosopher by the name of Graham Oppy. If you're not familiar with Graham Oppy, he's regarded as perhaps the leading academic atheist philosopher in analytic philosophy. There's lots of other popular, uh, philosophers who talk about atheism and all that, but he's widely regarded as particularly authoritative and persuasive, and offers a lot of arguments that many theists of all different backgrounds appreciate. But while his criticisms of theism are quite thoughtful and quite good, I don't think his criticisms of idealism are all that good. And he wrote a paper called Against Idealism. And so you'll notice the title of the stream is Against Graham Oppy. And that's what it's mainly about. It's not that I'm against him personally or anything. It's just play on the title of his paper. So I guess on that note, I guess I can just get right into the paper. Let me just bring this up for you guys here. So as long as you can see, here it is, Against Idealism. And he starts it off in a kind of a funny way. He makes this joke here, but it also just goes to show you how many different definitions of idealism there are. He says, given the title of this chapter, you may think that I must be the kind of person who enjoys torturing small furry animals. How could anyone but a psychopath be against warm, fuzzy idealism? That's a good point. You got to be a psychopath to be against idealism, right, bros? But I mean, I don't know. I guess there's a definition of idealism out there that has to do with fuzzy animals and being kind to them. So, not sure what that's about. But the psychopath part, yeah, that's correct. And then he says, I start with considerations of naturalism. And he goes on to argue that naturalism is more theoretically virtuous than idealism. And he concludes that idealism is an unwelcome and unwarranted kind of skepticism. Now, off the bat, I can tell that there's misunderstandings of idealism already. So we're talking about it as if it's a kind of skepticism, which we've covered before, but quick rundown. Yeah, even George Berkeley, one of the original Western idealists in modern philosophy, talked about how actually idealism is a defense of common sense. We're not talking about a skeptical thesis. He would argue, in fact, it is materialism and even dualism that offers a skeptical thesis, because with idealism, what you see is what you get. Reality is experience. You're having experiences, so you really do see the real world the way it really is. And that doesn't sound like skepticism at all. That sounds like common sense. However, dualism and even materialists would have you believe, well, there's more than experience. There's this other world out there. And there's all these thought experiments people cook up. They talk about like the Matrix or brain in a vat. And it's like they ask, well, how do you know you're not in a brain in a vat or in the Matrix? For all you know, maybe none of this is real, or your experiences are just a representation of the real world. And so you don't actually see the real world. See, those sound like skepticism to me. And George Berkeley would agree. So on the contrary, idealism is not a form of skepticism. And even, the OG, George Berkeley, personal friend of the show, by the way, even he would agree. Got to have him back on the show again. So he goes in this next part here. He goes, according to the type of naturalism that I prefer, the mindedness of organisms is explained entirely in terms of natural properties. Okay, so he kind of makes a quick list here about, some things properties of the environment, organisms, the evolutionary, social, and local histories of organisms and all that stuff. So he kind of makes this list here, but honestly, I'm not saying throughout this paper and elsewhere, and with other naturalists in general, I'm not seeing a good definition of what it even really means to be natural. I'm not quite sure what a natural property is supposed to be. I've heard people try to use this term to mean, well, it's what science describes. something that's natural is the things that are described by science. And even if that were true, well, okay, but that only tells me that science is describing certain things, and you're kind of just pointing to these things, but you're not really telling me what it is these things are. You're just telling me, well, this is what science tells us about. But what is this thing that you're trying to tell us about? So, and this happens a lot. There's many different definitions that many people try to throw out there, and sometimes it's almost equated with physical. It's almost as if naturalism almost is physicalism. And that's what Oppy sounds like a little bit here when he gets into more detail. But if they're not equating naturalism and physicalism, if they're just talking about natural, just to mean, oh, what we can observe, or what's predictable, or something like that, it's just none of those descriptions actually define the word natural. And I think this ambiguity of natural and, on the contrary, the supernatural, that ambiguity is where they slip in, I think, these points that I will get into more detail later, actually. But that ambiguity, it hides the fact that they sort of slip in certain assumptions, and then they make assumptions about the so-called supernatural. And I guess I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here, but the point is, I'll get to that later. The point is that the term natural, it really doesn't seem to offer us anything descriptive. Like, it's not really telling me about, well, there's properties of a certain type called natural, and then there's non-natural properties, and these are somehow distinct or something like that. I see no reason to believe in that. I believe in mental properties, experiential properties. As an idealist, I think that's all there are. It's just one kind of properties. So I see no reason to use this language of natural. I can just talk about what we can experience, what we can observe, what we can describe, predict, and all that. But at no point do I need to use such language. And this will lead to another important point here. So I was going to read this real quick. Okay, I will do this very quickly because I'm going to actually lead into another point. But I just want to say this very quickly just so we make sure we understand Oppy. So he says, for the purposes of the discussion, he's going to talk about naturalism like this. He says that fundamental causal reality is entirely natural. He says that mindedness is late and local in the causal order, that mindedness is fully explained in terms of neural and biological processes that occur in natural organisms, in natural environments with appropriate natural histories, and human beings are minded organisms. Okay, so other than the fourth one, this is particularly physicalistic. He can use the term naturalism or naturalist and all that, but particularly number 3 is clearly, the very physicalist in that language there. So basically what we're dealing with in many ways is physicalism. And so I guess I'll get into some more details on that, the rant on there. But this is just to outline what he's trying to get at here, just as definitions for clarity. When it comes to idealism, he says, fundamental causal reality is entirely mental. Okay, so far so good. Minds are neither late nor local in the causal order. Potentially, there's some issues I may have with this because maybe you say some minds are late, some minds are local, but maybe not all minds. Maybe there's the fundamental mind. And so perhaps you may not have to affirm two quite so sharply. Then he says non-mental objects are fully explained in terms of contents of minds. I would rather say there is no such thing as non-mental objects, but I do like this idea of explaining in terms of contents of minds. I'm okay with that. That what you normally call a non-mental object, it's really just a content of the mind. It's an experience, it's a thought, it's an idea, something, a sensation. So, those are just lists. That's just a list of different mental things. So, or contents of the mind. And of course, human beings are minds, which I guess that's a cool way to put it. We are minds instead of minded organisms, depending on how you use the word mind. But before I get to this next point, there's actually someone I want to bring in here. I have a surprise guest. I hope they're ready to go here. I'm going to go ahead and just bring them to the stage. Let's see if they're ready. Yo, what's up, dude? How's it?
Hello.
Hey, we got Christian Idealism in the house. What's up, buddy? Have you been?
Pretty good. Glad to be here.
Right on. Okay, cool. So if you want, we can just get right into this. I'm just going to read this part real quick, and then you can go ahead and give your response to this. According to the naturalist, our universe is causal reality. There is nothing in causal reality that does not figure in a more detailed telling of the history recounted in the paragraph where he just talks about the Big Bang and all that. So, according to the idealist, he claims the centerpiece of causal reality is a supernatural mind. So, what do you think of that?
Sorry, you broke up a little bit, but so yeah, I mean, the first thing is, I mean, that's just simply not true. I mean, idealists are committed to the idea that there's only one ontological kind of thing in reality, right? This whole language of natural and supernatural is just completely and utterly meaningless under a monistic ontology. So I don't know where he's getting. I mean, it would be one thing if he cited his sources on like where he's getting this idea from, but every idealist, at least in the contemporary sense, would completely deny that assertion. So that's the first thing, which is like it's not really clear where he's getting this idea that idealists are committed to a supernatural mind, because they're not, at least definitionally. If we're making this distinction, this ontological distinction between natural and supernatural world, the idealist is going to deny that distinction. So yeah, I mean that's just not true, right? And so if you understand idealism as a view where everything is, you know, one ontological category, ontological monism, then naturalism cannot win against idealism on grounds of this categorical simplicity that, or this kind of simplicity is referring to. Now, another thing I want to point, there's a few things here as well. So additionally, suppose that the naturalist is committed to the simplest version of his view. Let's say that naturalists are committed to the proposition that all that exists is space-time properties and sets. And from this, you know, from these, I guess we can call them axioms, we can build all of our other objects that make up the observable universe, right? And we call these things minded organisms, sofas, sculptures, etc. But this gives us three kinds of basic entities, right? So we've basically what the naturalist is doing is we have space and time, we have properties and sets, right? These are our three categories. But the idealist only needs one kind of basis entity. We could say that the fundamental thing of reality is not space and time, is not properties, not sets, but rather is just some.
Nope. Sound like you cut out a little bit there.
Bradley's
There
view.
you go.
Am I breaking up?
Oh, yeah, you're good now.
Yeah. So if you want to go with Bradley's view, you could say, well, it's just experience in and of itself. We don't even have to talk about mind. It just depends on what kind of idealism you're referring to. Or you could just say it's just experience in and of itself. And that's kind of like treated as like kind of the substance that exists, right? And if we take this account, we can say that given the existence of experiencing minds or experiencing mind or just experience simpliciter, the idealist can account for the total structure of reality in much simpler commitments than the naturalist, right? Now, of course, maybe Oppy doesn't agree with my characterization of dividing categories in that kind of way under his system. But there is no possible. The point is, like, even if we give him everything he wants, there's no way in which the naturalist is going to be simpler. At least if we're going with this view. Now, there is this more fundamental problem that I think the paper seems to rely upon. So his entire argument, I mean, not just this argument in particular, but even the entire methodology that he's using here is highly, highly questionable, just from a philosophy of science perspective. So I guess I don't want to get too much into the philosophy
Yeah,
of science, but
we'll get
I'll,
into that in a moment if you'd like.
I'll,
Or
I'll
we'll
try
go
to
ahead.
simplify here if you want me to explain where Oppy's view is actually coming from and where I think within the philosophy of science he's getting these ideas from, if you want me to get into that.
So we can get into that. I just want to make
Yeah.
a comment about the fundamental mind as well.
Yeah,
Real quick.
you can. Go
I
ahead.
will.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's going to be really important to check out. So stay tuned for that, guys. So when he talks about, because I think a lot of materialistic types, naturalist types, a lot of these atheists, I think a lot of them are very prepared for the dialectic of materialism versus dualism. And they have arguments to go against the dualists. But when you encounter a monistic option like idealism, who's not claiming there's two different kinds of stuff, there's a natural and a supernatural and things like that, I just think people like Oppy aren't quite prepared for that. They sort of default, they land back on that dualistic dialectic, and they just sort of use those arguments against the idealist. And that's actually one. I have many reasons why my username is the way it is, but one of the reasons I actually have the name monistic idealism was I kept having to remind people I'm a monist, not a dualist. And this happens a lot, even among professional philosophers. They talk about idealism as if it's this sort of dualism, and you'll see later on that's also what fuels his accusations that, oh, naturalism is more virtuous, there's less entities because you posit this extra thing. But the idealist corrects them and says no. And plus, even in the book where this chapter is published, the very next chapter after Oppy is by Helen Yetter Chapel, where she argues that you can have idealism without God. She has more of like a pluralist view, I think, where there isn't a fundamental mind. There's just a plurality of maybe it's non-selves. There's just experience, just a tapestry of experience, however you want to put it. But yeah, there are different versions of idealism where you don't even need a fundamental mind. You just have just like how there's atomism, and you have a bunch of little atoms that are fundamental. The idealist can also have little minds that are fundamental. Or there's just one mind that's fundamental. Just like how the physicalist can say maybe there's one physical object that's fundamental. So when you compare that, idealism and materialism can actually be on par in terms of the number of entities. It's not like idealism posits more or less in that sense. It's possible that they're pretty much equal on that. But there's other things I can say on that, but that'll have to deal with other comments that he'll say later on. In the meantime, I'd like to actually hear what you have to say about his methodology, because I think you do a good job of pulling the rug from underneath Oppy here.
Yeah, so his entire, I mean, it's not just the arguments, but the way in which he is approaching this, like from the very beginning, relies upon a very specific understanding of how we should do theory comparison. Okay, so this is basically Oppy's view, and I know this is Oppy's view because I've emailed him about this, and he's confirmed that okay, this is his view. So this is how it works. Okay, you have your worldview. Within your worldview, there's two categories. There's what we call your non-derivable beliefs, and then your derivable beliefs. Your non-derivable beliefs, you can term what he calls them your axioms. Okay. Your non-derivable beliefs are the beliefs that can be logically entailed from your axioms in some way or another. Okay. And so basically what you could say is that he treats your entire worldview, all the beliefs that you have, as quite literally an axiomatic system. Okay. And I'm sure we all know how axiomatic systems work.
Right.
You know, you have theorems, and then you try to derive your theorems from your axioms, right? That's how mathematics works. That's how logic works, right? And of course, there's different systems. But what he does is he basically treats your entire worldview, so all your beliefs, he treats that as an axiomatic system. Okay. And then what he does, so this is how he does the comparison. He takes one set, so again, he's taking your axiomatic system. Then you have these worldviews, you have these different beliefs that people have about the world. And how he does the comparison is this. He says, okay, if I have a belief in, let's say, the existence of cats, well, can I derive my beliefs about cats, is that logically entailed from some other prior belief that I might have? Well, probably not, right? There's nothing about cats that can be logically entailed from any other belief that I may have about the world, right? Um, and so then he treats in this case, cats, my belief in cats, as an axiom. It's in a commitment that I have. Okay. And so the best worldview in this case is going to be the worldview that minimizes the amount of axioms that you have, right? And so basically, if you have all your beliefs, you put it, out from the table, say, to use kind of an analogy, if I can't logically derive all my beliefs from, one set of axioms, or let's say two or three axioms, well, then anything I cannot derive from one or two, three axioms are going to become new axioms, and those are going to be additional commitments in my worldview, right? And so then how he does it is, well, the worldview that is the best worldview is going to be the worldview that has basically the least amount of axioms, but yet and from those axioms you can then logically entail all your other beliefs. Okay, so I think this is how he does the comparison when it comes to with naturalism and in this case idealism. What he wants to say is something like this. He wants to say that, well, as a naturalist, I have my axiom be that there is a natural causal reality, that there's properties in the world, those kind of things, right? Just take very, very basic naturalistic worldview. And what he thinks that the idealist is doing in their worldview is like, well, the idealist has all their beliefs about all of natural reality, but then I also have these additional beliefs about experiencing minds or
Right.
properties of minds, and because those things are not logically derived from my other beliefs, well, then they're my new axioms, and so therefore some kind of any kind of idealism is going to be quote unquote less simple. Now here's the thing. Here's the interesting part, which is that I agree with Oppy that if we took this methodology and if we applied it consistently across any, not just idealism, but any worldview against any other worldview, I agree. Oppy's view would be the best view, right? If you're going to try to axiomatize your worldview, and if you want the worldview with the least amount of axioms that entails the most, from there, then Oppy's worldview is going to be the best, right? In this case, Oppy naturalism is going to be the best worldview. The problem is that we can question that methodology. We can say, I don't agree with this methodology, and here's why. And so here's something I think is important to understand. I think that Oppy's methodology is basically it's what it really is. I mean, if you really want to get technical, it's a particular version, I would say, of hypothetical deductivism. And the reason why I say that is in hypothetical deductivism, it's a theory of scientific confirmation that says that you have to basically deduce everything from a set of what's called theoretical commitments, right? So you have your hypothesis. This hypothesis makes certain claims, and from that hypothesis, I have to, again, logically deduce, so it's deduction, I have to logically deduce certain pieces of evidence, okay? And so obviously, well, if I'm trying to create a worldview, and if I'm modeling my worldview in that kind of way, well, axiomatizing it actually makes sense, right? Because what I want to do is I want to say, hey, I have these certain data points out here that I cannot logically derive from a theoretical content. And so what do? Well, I just make it a part of my theoretical content, right? And so then I can explain it, right? So again, if we're viewing everything through this axiomatic lens, through this kind of deductive lens, then it's pretty much structurally identical to this hypothetical deductive model of scientific confirmation, right? Because everything's deductive, right? And so I think again, the reason why I say this is because Oppy has not explicitly stated that his system is a form of hypothetical deductivism, but I think it is, given the structure, given the logical way that it kind of works. I think hypothetical deductivism, in a sense, is the best representation of how Oppy's system would work within a scientific context. Now, here's the problem. There are major problems with hypothetical deductivism. And I'll just highlight a few in case some people are interested. So, the first problem, I would say, hold on, let me see if I could. Oh, wait, hold on. I have the wrong handout. Give me a second.
Okay, yeah, no problem. So let me see here.
Okay, I found it.
Yeah, go for it.
I accidentally. So the first thing, this is just, I'm just going to kind of summarize everything. So the first problem is degrees of confirmation. So a kind of crude hypothetical deductive model doesn't tell us how much a hypothesis is confirmed. Clearly, not all hypotheses are confirmed equally. Suppose I observe two ravens and note that they both looked black. This seems like some evidence that all ravens are black, but it is not very strong evidence. By contrast, Kepler's careful observation of the locations of the heavenly bodies and their close fit with the predictions of his theory. Fit close with the predictions of his theory. And so then it would provide more strong evidence for the theory. And so the problem is, number one, the HG model doesn't take into account degrees of confirmation. Number two, it faces a underdetermination problem because you can have several different theories, all of which all entail the same observed data. Number three is that typically scientific theories need auxiliary assumptions, which we can get into later if you're interested. But I think that one of the bigger problems is actually you can have confirmation by non-entailed evidence, right, as well. And that's just for the issues. And then if you're interested, if people want to get really deep into it, there's a paper or a book called Theories of Scientific Method. And they have a chapter going over kind of the structure of at least like paradoxes that kind of result from this particular theory of scientific confirmation. And so my point here, and then of course, finally, I think here's the biggest problem, at least now it is true that the HD model has been defended within the literature, but the way that Oppy specifically has, I guess, framed it, at least his system, there's no one has ever in the history of the philosophy of science has ever tried to do theory comparison in the way that he does it, in this kind of axiomatic way. That just doesn't work. In fact, I don't think science in general, I don't think scientific theories can be treated as axiomatic systems in the first place. I think that they're going to be treated in terms of induction, and, I would hold to a Bayesian theory of confirmation. And so I would completely, my differences between Oppy would be, very, very big, right? Because, Bayesian confirmation theory is completely and utterly distinct, and it's a rival to the hypothetical deductive model. But the point here is that what I want to emphasize here is like this methodology could be questioned the way that he's setting this up, and there are very serious objections in the literature that would show that hypothetical deductivism doesn't work. And if hypothetical deductivism does not work, then his system doesn't work either, because it's really just a version of that. If you have any questions, let me know. But that's basically my main
There you go.
issue.
Perfect. Okay, so that's good. So I think what Christian idealism is doing here, this is actually quite wise, because a lot of times what happens is, this happens when it comes to when you're discussing idealism or even theism and stuff like that. Sometimes, like the atheist or the physicalist will sort of put a standard on you, and sometimes the one who disagrees with them will just sort of accept that standard implicitly, and then just try to win over the other person, try to like win on their terms, try to convince them like that. But I think the dice is loaded. I think the game was rigged from the start. It's the way they set their axioms up from the beginning in general, the way their whole methodology is set up, the way they're approaching it. Like you said, there's a flaw there. So I think getting more fundamental and, not just falling for, trying to win by their rules, try to actually go back and really examine what's being said here. And then you will often see a mistake at the very beginning. You'll go, oh, your whole starting point was flawed. So I think that's good rhetorically to do, just in general, to always get more fundamental and try to identify the premise that the other person is relying on. Because once you can get at that, the whole house of cards can fall apart once you pick that apart. So I guess what I can get into next is I'll kind of read a little bit more, and we can both share our thoughts on this. But I'll read a little bit more of this quote. So he says, the supernatural mind contains a developing representation that exactly matches the account of the universe they talked about before, about the Big Bang and all that. He says the temporal domain that the supernatural mind inhabits is populated by other minds. One for each minded organism that figures into the complete account of the universe and all of that. And he talks again, he says, within this temporal domain that the minds inhabit, there's a two-way transmission of information between the supernatural mind and the organismic minds. So real quick, before I continue on too far with that, well, I'm not sure about how the fundamental mind is within the temporal domain. You could actually probably argue the temporal domain is actually within the fundamental mind, because usually space and time is reduced under such a view. It's not like we're within time, time's within the
Here's
mind
one thing
here.
I wanted to add to this. I think he's thinking he thinks that he's thinking within the logic of, let's say, the physicalist, where space and time are fundamental. But that's
Yes,
not the logic of the idealist,
correct,
who thinks
correct.
that space and time is actually not fundamental, and that there is this underlying, like, space and time are just basically constructs of a deeper reality. And
Yes,
that's a huge problem that I see all the time in these discussions. Because in order to understand the idealist view, you have to work from within the logic of the system, and that's not what Oppy's doing here.
yes. I think he's too used to the materialism versus dualism dialectic. He keeps falling back on this dualistic language there and talking about time and space in these ways that are also irreducible and all that. And it's just he's not really realizing that the idealist just doesn't see things that way. But another thing that stuck out to me was, maybe he gets this from Berkeley. He talks about how there's a two-way transmission of information between the supernatural mind and the organismic mind. I think Berkeley might have talked in this way, but it's important to note, and this is how many idealists are these days, there's such a thing as objective idealism, where they believe there is this sort of objective reality that's not dependent on a mind. There's a world that we are perceiving, but its nature is mental. So it's not like there needs to be this transmission of the fundamental mind to the derivative minds. You can have this world that is just a mental world, and minds are just able to perceive that world, just like how you would in a physicalist model. So I think that he just kind of has a very strange idea of idealism. And to be fair, he does talk about how there are different versions of it, but the way he talks about idealism, he talks as if this is just idealism. This is like the main version of it. And you even brought up a good point about how there isn't even really like a citation here. He does at the end, of course, cite some people, but in specifics, right here in this paragraph, he's not telling us who this idealist that he's talking about that believes
Hello.
this. Can you hear me now?
No, yeah,
Or
sorry.
can you
I
hear me?
I don't know why. Anyways, what I was gonna add is just it would be nice if he could cite, like, where idealists are saying this, because maybe
Correct.
like, if you want to critique like some version of idealism, then that's fine. But to kind of make this broad generalization about it is, that's where I think it would have fallen into issues. But anyways, but yeah, that's all I want to say.
Yeah, no, I completely see it the same way. And so let me just let's see what else is left in this quote here. So it says transmission from the mind, whatever. So we may not be able to actually respond to the rest of this quote here. I think we can move on. We made our point there. So now he gets into the section on comparative review, which I think Christian idealism already preemptively addressed some of this But here's the thing. So an important point to make. So methodologically speaking, Oppy is mistaken, as pointed out by my co-host here. But another point I think, and we kind of already touched on this, is that even if you assume his methodology is correct, the way he's adding up the numbers here, I think, is incorrect. His math is incorrect. He's misunderstanding idealism too much and interpreting it as too dualistic. And here's a really good example of this. And I think you already have some good thoughts on this too. So I'm just going to read this out real quick. First, let's consider the ontology of the two positions. On the one hand, naturalist is committed to the denizens of the universe, minded organisms, sofas, sculptures, cars, and all that, and nothing else. But on the other hand, the idealist is committed to all of the denizens of the universe, as well as to a supernatural mind, and its contents and all of that. So he goes on to say, so the naturalists agree to the existence of these things, but the idealist believes all these things and more, is what he's
Yeah,
trying
so
to
this
say.
is exactly where his methodology comes in, where he's basically counting all the beliefs that the idealist would have. And then he goes that whole system where, like, oh well, if you can't logically drive these beliefs, then they're additional axioms. Basically, that's the idea.
Okay, yeah, and I guess you already preemptively addressed that. But
Yeah. So
oh, go ahead. Yeah, what do you want to say?
no, because I was gonna say, like, I think that this entire thing relies upon his methodology, which I already think doesn't work in the first place. So
Correct. And the point I guess I want to make too is that even within that methodology, the math doesn't add up. The idealist doesn't think of it this way. The idealism is a version of substance monism, just like physicalism, which I'm sure the naturalist would want to say. Like he implicitly said there's only causal reality and it's natural. So there's this sort of one substance ontology here. And
yeah,
the idealist is saying the same thing.
one thing I was gonna add too. You could bring in the objective idealist and just say, like, all the things that are listed here are just like, they just have mental properties. That's not adding anything. Because if the naturalist wants to preclude idealism, they have to also add in their ideas of what properties are as well. So that's just another point. But yeah.
Absolutely. So let's get to this next point here. Let's consider the ontology here again. He says, the naturalist is committed to the ideal. This is such a weird sentence. He says, so the naturalist is committed to the ideology needed to characterize the universe and its denizens and to nothing else. I'm not sure why this wouldn't apply to the
Yep.
idealist. I mean, why wouldn't the idealist? I mean, the idealist also is holding to an ideology that is characterizing the universe and its denizens. And there's really no need to talk about it as if there's more than these things here like that. Like, and especially depending on your definition of universe and all of that. And another point I want to make here, let me say this too, because this will make it more clear. So the materialist, if they're not atomistic, if they're not pluralistic, okay, if they don't think atoms are what's fundamental, these little atoms, maybe they think it's the universe as a whole that is what's fundamental. Just like Jonathan Schaffer, who's a materialist as well. Well, the idealist doesn't have to see it that way. We can see the universe as reducible. The universe is not this irreducible thing that's fundamental. We can just reduce it to being another content of the mind. And so, really, what's fundamental is the mind and its denizens.
Yeah.
And so, you don't have to say the universe and its denizens. You can just say the mind and its denizens. And so, and if you do the math there, there's not more entities or even less. It sounds like they're both these monistic ontologies, and he's trying to count them like as if they're dualistic, like as if there's
Yeah,
all
and
this other
he
stuff
runs.
going
I'll
on.
get into the properties problem in a moment, but he kind of runs into a big problem if he's going to go this route, because
Absolutely.
there's an easy, and I'll get into it, but there's a way you can kind of reverse all this and show that actually the naturalist is committed to more than the idealist.
Based. All right. See, that's going to be an important point to bring up. And this point, I think, is also very crucial that we can both really jump on here. He says, according to the naturalist, there's just one kind of causation, natural causation. But then he says, according to the idealist, there's two kinds of causation. There's natural causation in the universe, and a type of causation that underwrites the transfer of information between minds
Yeah,
in the
no.
purely temporal domain. So why
So
don't
the
you go
second
first on
part
that?
is not true at all. That's just false. That assumes a subjective view of the idealist picture, which as an objective idealist, you can just deny that.
Sure. And I mean, I even have a video called The Argument from Mental Causation for Idealism, where I argue that the idealist affirms causal closure, that they affirm there's only one type of causation. All causation is mental causation. So it's not like there's two different types of causation. And on the contrary, I would challenge the so called naturalist here to try to make sense of mental causation. I already go into much more detail in that video,
Yeah.
but basically, they're going to have a very hard time making sense of it because either you're going to have to reduce it to just physical causation, whatever, which we already know the hard problem trying to reduce the mental to
Well,
the
I mean,
physical. That's an issue, but
idealist.
also, well, hold on, I want to finish this
Yeah,
thought.
go ahead.
But also, it's just that like I mean, oftentimes when you try to attempt that, you lapse into some kind of behaviorism, or maybe you lapse into something that maybe even looks a bit like epiphenomenalism, where really there's no room for mental causes. There's just particles and chemicals and biology just sort of bumping into each other doing its thing, but the mental causes would be excluded. So I think on the contrary, he's going to have problems with mental causation in all of that. But the idealist makes sense of all of it perfectly.
I was gonna say, in defense of Oppy, I will say that he is an identity theorist, and so there's a question of whether identity theory is even a coherent view. But assuming it is, assuming it works, I
Right.
don't think that would be a particular issue for him. But
Right. Yeah. And that's another issue that I'd have to, yeah, like I said. So if he wants to try to reduce the physical to the mental, like an identity theorist, or rather the other way around, reduce the mental to the physical. Okay. If he
yeah,
wants to do that, okay, sure, he can do that and possibly say there is only one type of causation. However, as we know, that leads to other issues about the hard problem. That's, there's independent problems with that come up. But basically, yeah, just like how a physicalist is saying there's one type of causation in that sense, so can the idealist. So,
I have a lot to say as well in response to what we just read.
okay, yeah. Oh, you got
Um,
something written down here?
yeah, so let's consider the following comparison. Let's say that you experience physical objects, but these objects have properties. You experience mental phenomena like color, sounds, textures, forms, feelings, etc. What you experience, what you experience is properties, not physical objects directly. If you remove the properties, then there is nothing left to describe the object. Think of an apple. You can describe it as red, round, hard, shiny, and tasty. However, if you remove all of these in principle sensible properties, what are you left with to describe the object? You lack a material substance to account for the apple. Instead, you experience it purely in terms of in principle sensible properties. When you remove these in principle sensible properties, then nothing is left. So, contrary to Oppy's comparison, it is actually a naturalist who is adding stuff into what we already experience. What the idealist uses to characterize the universe are in principle sensible properties, colors, sounds, smells, etc., and nothing else. What the naturalist uses, however, to characterize the universe are the same in principle sensible properties, but also attributes an additional material substance to these properties. Furthermore, the idealist is also committed to one causation, which is mental causation. The naturalist and idealist both accept that there is an objective causal reality. However, the idealist simply does not acknowledge that this world is ontologically distinct from consciousness itself. Indeed, by idealists looking upon the world that is outside of their own personal mentation, it is fully compatible with natural or mental causation. And so I go a little bit more into his location and mindset. But yeah, I think that is like the main issue with this, which is like the idealists can easily reverse it and just say like, hey, we both agree that there is these in principle sensible properties, and that's all that I believe in. But yet, you, the naturalist, if you're trying to exclude idealism from the picture, well, you also believe in these in principle sensible properties, but you attribute these additional mystical mental, or sorry, not mental, material
Physical, yeah.
substance beyond, like, it's completely and utterly mystical, this material substance that exists beyond our mental sensations.
Yeah, that's exactly how I feel too when they talk about like
Yeah.
whether they talk about physical, material, or natural. I have the same sentiment. It's the same idea that like, well, look, even if you're trying to be an identity theorist, it's like, okay, so you understand you have experiences, you know there's experience. And so even if you're trying to reduce that experience, you're still trying to say, well, there's experience and then there's more than experience. There's, all of this other stuff that's out there. And the idealist can just say, well, there's just experience. I don't need to say there's a
Yeah.
whole
So I
mystery
think
realm beyond
it's
experience.
interesting because, like, even within Oppy's own system, I think this is where the idealist actually would win. So,
Well, see, there you go. You see, we're kind of like a good cop, bad cop here. I'm trying to be like, well, maybe they're more similar in terms of monism, but you're like, no, actually, the idealist can capitalize on this more. We can actually show that they're more complicated, that we're more simple. And I think even those like Bernardo Castro make this point too.
yeah,
They try to say that actually the idealist is simpler.
yeah,
And I resonate with that point. I agree for the most part. But from a broader perspective, like if I've zoomed out, they're both versions of monism. They're not dualism. Okay, there's no need to apply this dualistic rhetoric to idealism. It just doesn't apply. But if you get into the nitty gritty details, perhaps idealism does win on simplicity, as many idealists argue. Lots of people make that point. So let's go to this next quote we got from him here. He says, on the one hand, the naturalist is committed to those principles and laws that are required for the universe. Again, so does the idealist. On the one hand, the idealist is committed to these principles and laws that are required for the domain of minds and all of that. And so he's trying to say that there's more again. It's just basically, I guess, the point we've already addressed.
yeah. It's
The
it's
same
assuming this dualism.
misunderstanding. Yeah, it's
It's
just assuming a dualism.
and I
It's
do
assuming
have
that the
something to
idealism is adding
say.
more.
I do have something to say in response to this law's objection.
Okay.
Now, I do think that idealism is equal in regards to this. So, under naturalism, the laws of nature are seen as irreducible causal powers somehow built into the fabric of the cosmos, right? Assuming the cosmos, of course, in this case, is ontologically beyond consciousness. Now, under idealism, such irreducible causal powers are posited to somehow be built into universal consciousness itself. However, they, in this case, the laws and patterns, are the same patterns that naturalism entails as inherent to consciousness, as physical laws are allegedly inherited to the fabric of space and time. Again, the space and time being something that's beyond consciousness. So idealism posits no extra difficulty than naturalism in this regard. On idealism, the laws of nature are governing, or the laws that govern universal consciousness, just as any physical laws of naturalism are governing the cosmos. Again, I'm referring to cosmos as something that's ontologically distinct from consciousness. In this case, again, on the idealist picture, minds and natural reality are not distinct. Rather, they are both the same kind and run by the same underlying laws. On idealism, the foundation for reality is mind, and reality itself would be inherently mental. Now, another thing I wanted to add just here, I didn't write it down, but basically, if the naturalist, let's say the naturalist believes in like agents, or not agents, but like, let's say minded organisms. Well, I mean, that's really no different than the idealists believing that there are agents as well. The only difference is that there's going to be a difference in there's different conceptions in terms of like what is the nature of those things, but the actual laws invoked are pretty much identical. Like even Bernardo Kastrup has said multiple times, like, hey, like, I believe in nature. I believe all that exists is nature. I just think that nature is mental. Um, the laws of nature as well. Like it's the same pattern. So there's nothing extra that's being added
Yeah,
on
you
the
can basically just replace the word physical with the word mental. And basically whatever the physicalist is doing, so can the idealist. Like if you're talking about this physical universe with physical laws, you can just say, well, there's a mental universe with mental laws. And this isn't an addition. It's not like the naturalist or physicalist is somehow having less
Yeah.
entities on those terms. No, they're, like you said before, equal actually in that sense. So once again, over prepared for dualism and not prepared enough for idealism.
When idealists, yeah. So if you want to read that, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So when idealists insist that organisms being conscious is something over and above their undergoing certain kinds of neural processes, idealist is taking an additional bunch of theoretical commitments that naturalist does not
Well,
take
that's
on.
just completely and utterly false. Like, I was at when I read that the first time, I was like utterly shocked because I'm like, what? Does he really think? Okay, no. Like, even if let's just take we could take. I mean, I don't know if you would take this view, but like, we could take like an identity theorist idealism, where basically the mind just is neural processes, but the nature of the neural processes themselves are inherently mental. Okay. If we take that view, that does not at all commit us to believing there's something over and above their underlying neural processes, because the very nature of neural processes is mental, just like everything else is mental.
Yeah,
So
there's
that's
almost
complete. Yeah,
yeah,
that just
there's this implicit, almost emergentist picture here. It's as
yeah,
if there's underneath what's fundamental, what underlies is neural process, and then what's over and above that is consciousness. And really, the idealist, particularly a monistic one, would say kind of the other way around. It's not that consciousness is over and above neural processes, but rather neural processes are nothing over and above consciousness. Really,
yeah.
they're just consciousness, and what you're calling a neural process is just a process of consciousness.
Yeah, just
So,
like everything else in
yeah,
the universe would be a
precisely.
process of consciousness. It's
Yeah,
just that
exactly.
neural processes are just a very specific type of process of consciousness, such that you can have like agents. Basically, that's the only difference.
Yeah, and when you say type there, it's not like they're different. And when you say type,
No.
it's not like a different type as an ontological type.
Yeah.
So, okay, I think we've addressed that point. And there's a lot of other stuff he talks about that I didn't really need to address. Um, One thing I will say too, it's a bit, I think it's in this paragraph. I won't address it, but he makes this point about necessity and contingency and the initial state of the supernatural mind. And I won't go over it, it's too technical, but it's just strange because it seems like his point about the initial state of the mental world, I don't see how that wouldn't apply to the physical world or the natural world. His point about necessity and contingency would seem to apply just as much to that. So again, I won't focus on this at all, but if anyone takes the time to read this paragraph, just apply it to his own view, and I think he kind of steps on a rake there. Um, so let's read this next point here. Is there a good reason to suppose that idealists offer explanations of this kind of data, this scientific data, empirical data, and all that, better than the explanations that are offered by the naturalists? And he says it's hard to see how there could be. And he goes on to explain why here, but I think we already know why. Um, do you have anything to say to this point right
Not
here?
really. No. Um,
Okay. So I think, like I already mentioned before, but I'll just to cover more ground here to be safe. I think idealists actually do have better explanation of human behavior. I think we can make better sense of mental causation. I think non-idealist views will either um, fail to keep mental causation, or they will, end up falling into like the hard problem of consciousness in some ways. So, and they're just gonna, no matter what, they're gonna lose out on something. So I think actually idealism offers a much better explanation of what's going on here. I think physicalism and non-idealist views lack explanatory power on human behavior because you need mental terms to explain this behavior. Even contemporary psychologists and philosophers agree to this point. And if you end up trying to be more of a naturalist, you can't use such terms. You end up trying to use reductive terms of physics and chemistry, but that doesn't do the job. You end up in the same problems as the behaviorist or epiphenomenalist. You end up not being able to explain behavior. So that would be my point there.
okay. Is this the last thing that you want to respond to?
There's a couple things actually. I have a couple things highlighted, but I know that you can't be here for the whole stream. There's actually a
Yeah,
lot
I'm
more
gonna
stuff
have
to
to.
address.
I'm gonna. I'll leave after this then.
Yeah, is there any other points you want to Just kind of get out here.
So here, I mean, this is beyond his additional comparisons. I mean, I'll keep it brief. Also, don't forget to.
Oh, dang, you cut out right when you said don't forget to, and it just cut out. Dang, I still can't hear you.
Oh, okay. Am I good?
There you are now. Yeah.
Okay. So what I was gonna say is that when it comes to this first thing, so on the one hand, idealist explanation must appeal to the creative intention of the supernatural mind. Well, hold on, stop right there. Okay. Now, of course, I'm a theist, so I'm gonna have to like get out of my theism camp a little bit, and I'll just say this: that is not true of all forms of idealism. There are versions of idealism where there is no intention. Like if you take Schopenhauer's view, like you literally just have this will. It has no intentions, right? So I don't think that this particular
Yeah. You
view is
really,
going to. I mean, it might be a problem for like theistic idealism, but it's not going to be a problem for like some version of non-theistic idealism or deistic idealism where you actually don't have any intentions involved in the processes of the universal mind, right? So yeah.
yeah. And also, I mean, even a view like my own, who actually has a very dreamlike view of idealism and stuff like that. And this goes way back. A lot of idealists have talked about life as a dream. Um, Dreams don't have to be intentional. They can, the surrealist artists are very known for having this very free form association where they're not intending anything. It's just whatever happens, happens. And you
Yep.
could easily see this universe as just more of a surrealist universe where the fundamental mind just sort of lets things happen however they happen. They're not intending decidedly like, oh, this is what's going to happen next. And that's why this is like this because I feel this way today. Or, you don't need a psychological explanation for everything like that. You can have this idealist view where it's actually more free flowing.
You know what? That actually, you know what? I'm gonna step back into the ideal and to the theistic camp and say that, and this is my view. So I think that God is an artist, um, which highlights your point, which is like God is not like the mechanic where he's like, you know, meticulously deciding every single thing that happens, but rather he kind of he creates what's called this initial world segment. Okay, he has this idea of what he wants the universe to be, but then he creates this initial world segment. So he's responsible for that. But then after that, everything else is, random, right? This is a
Oh, it cut out
model.
again.
Okay, am I good? Hello?
Whoa. Okay, you there?
Yeah.
Okay, there you are.
So what I was going to say is that if we view God as an artist, you could say that, well, God intended for the initial world segment, but everything else after that, God actually didn't necessarily, at least directly intend, right? If you take this kind of disjunctive model of creation, everything that's non-initial is going to be, random, right? And so in that case, the universe is going to be more like art rather than this like machine, right? This deterministic machine. And so I think viewing it that way also kind of gets around this kind of objection. Now, what Oppy might say in response is he'll say something like, well, God intended to be the artist. God intended to create this art piece we call the universe, right? Um, but again, I mean, he's assuming his particular, I mean, he's assuming his methodology. So what I would do, I guess, in response is like, I just question your methodology of how you're looking at this, right? But yeah, anyways, that's all I have to say.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, was there anything else you wanted to say for the stream? Or was that it for
Is there
this
anything
point?
else? Is there any like
Oh
big
yeah.
paragraphs you highlighted
Yeah. I
below?
got a couple of different things. And I have a video. I have a 10-minute video clip I'm gonna be
Okay, yeah, I'll
watching with
get
the
going then
audience.
because
Okay.
I've said everything I need to that needs to be said on my
All right.
end.
Well, hey,
So,
really appreciate you having on. Thank you very much, Christian Idealism. It was a real pleasure. We appreciate it.
all right, thank you.
Have a good night. Bye. Okay. Now it's just the Just Us League. So let's see here. And also another thing I want to say too, he says this is a weak kind of explanation. He says it thinks it invokes a new theoretical commitment each time a new piece of data is considered. I'm not really seeing why that's true. Even if we believe, for instance, that there are intentions, let's say that there are, like in some sense, he does sort of intend certain things to happen. Well, I'm not saying why you would need a new theoretical commitment each time. You can have this, okay, well, I'm intending to create a universe that has freedom and all that, and here you go. So there are intentions, okay. But I'm not saying how that's necessarily new in comparison to the physical cosmos or the natural universe. If you have the natural universe, right, where every time something happens, I mean, isn't there going to be an explanation of that? Isn't there a reason that the physical universe did what it did? Even if you don't attribute it to intentions, there's clearly a reason things happen. So if you don't need a new theoretical commitment each time you explain something happening in the universe, I don't see why the idealist would need that as well. So, in this next quote here, he says, on the other hand, naturalist explanations appeal to the immediate, local, social, and evolutionary histories of an organism. And so this goes again before. So he's trying to explain things in terms of what just their environment and just basically with physics and chemistry and biology and all of that. But I guess I already went over how that's insufficient for explaining what we would normally attribute to mental causation. So yeah, this general idea of like if you want to explain how billiard balls bump and collide and move into each other and form these different patterns on the pool table and all of that, sure. But if you want to explain something a bit more complicated like human behavior, fortunately that's just not quite good enough. There's not enough explanatory power there. And so I think actually that's where the idealist wins on explanatory power. Let's see. In this next quote, he says, for all that has been argued explicitly, there may be some other kind of idealism that is more theoretically virtuous than the kind of naturalism that has been figured in my discussion. So I just wanted to read that to let you know that, yes, to be fair, he does acknowledge that there are different versions of idealism, and that's good. I just wish he would have maybe considered those versions of idealism, especially since those are the ones that actually seem to be more popular. I mean, if you just look at guys like Bernardo Kastrup, um, I mean, he's got quite a following. Even when this paper was written back in 2017, you can see that, yeah, there was a following there. I mean, that was a very popular version. So I don't know. I'm not trying to accuse him of anything deliberate. I'm not saying he's strawmanning idealism or anything like that, but I think he kind of just went after a very weak version of idealism, which is a little disappointing because he's better than that. And so we're getting close to the end of the paper. All right, so here we go. Let's read this. He says, it's very curious that proponents of idealism have considered it to be a satisfactory counter to skepticism and the like. So at least he acknowledges that we normally would see it as a counter to skepticism. But on the contrary, he says, it seems to me that idealism is very close to the brain in a vat skepticism and other anti-naturalistic fantasies. Moreover, it seems to me that idealism is inferior to naturalism for much the same kinds of reasons that brain in a vat skepticism and other anti-naturalistic fantasies are inferior to naturalism. A proper weighing of theoretical virtues discloses that naturalism is the most virtuous worldview, and there's nothing warm and fuzzy about idealism. Hey, there's a lot that's warm and fuzzy about idealism, all right? So, what's going on here is that, again, it's all because of this mistaken way of looking at idealism. If you look at it like as if it's a form of skepticism, which he didn't justify in this paper, as far as I can tell, well, then I guess I can see why you'd have a problem. But as already went over, it's not a form of skepticism. In fact, it fits better with common sense. What you see is the real world because experience is the real world. And so for him, he'd have to say, well, it's more than experience. And on the contrary, that's when he is susceptible to these thought experiments, these skeptical scenarios. Because you got to ask him, well, how do you know you're not in a brain in a vat? How do you know you're not in the matrix and blah, blah, blah? And I think the idealist is actually more prepared to deal with that. So, on the contrary, I think it is this naturalism, this vacuous naturalism, which isn't even properly defined, I think that's inferior. At least idealists can make sense of the world with experience. We know directly and immediately what experience is. You don't even need words to know what experience is. You feel pain, you know what experience is. But natural, what is this natural? What does that mean? What does physical even mean? I'm not saying any reason to believe the natural world is anything different than the world of experience. And so, in the final, and at the very end of the paper, he says, no small furry animals were harmed in the writing of this paper. Well, that's okay, but he failed to mention that the large non-furry animals were harmed in the writing of this paper. So that's gonna be a yikes. So that's the end of his paper there. It's written in 2017. It's a chapter in a book called um, Idealism, New Essays in Metaphysics, which was published on Oxford University Press. And so, yeah, that's basically my rebuttal to his paper on idealism. So one day I'd like to talk with him, perhaps. I think that'd be interesting. Because I'd like to help him understand idealism a bit more. So what I'm going to do from here, actually, is I'm going to share with you guys this sort of 11-minute, I may not even watch the entire thing, but there's a 10-minute clip that I got here for you guys from a channel called Philosophy Visualized. So I want to give a shout out to them. Kind of a small channel. They just had this very recent discussion there with Graham Oppy, and theistic idealism comes up. And the guy on the right, Jason Reed, I think he does a pretty good job actually of dealing with Oppy here. He has some good questions. The form of theistic idealism he brings up is a bit radical, as you'll hear in the clip. He'll explain in the question what he's getting at. But I think Oppy, you can kind of see here that he's just not quite prepared. He doesn't really quite know how to deal with this. And I think the other guy has some good rebuttals to him. So let's go ahead and watch this together, guys. Wait a minute. Hold on a second. Hold on one second. Hold on a second, bros. Sorry if this is. I just realized something there. I'm realizing there may not actually be audio here for you guys. Oof. Glad I caught that before it went on for too long. Okay, good. So you guys should be able to hear that went on for about 18 seconds. Sorry about the silence there, guys. So let's go ahead and just bring this back. Okay, so here we go.
What if you said that? What if you said God is the only thing that exists?
So that makes it sound as though what you're going to go for is some sort of, I don't know.
See, so and I get why he may say that. Like, well, I'm not quite sure because that's such a unique version of theism. We don't normally encounter that where we say there's only God or there's just the mind of God or something like that. And you can just tell that he's just not quite sure how to handle this right away. This isn't something he's prepared for. Like it's not something he's already refuted in the past. So I do want to be respectful and not too harsh on him. I think a lot of what he says is going to be kind of off the cuff, off the top. And I think if he was a bit more thoughtful about it, he took the time to really process it, maybe he could come up with some better objections and points. But he's kind of going off the cuff here, and he makes some objections to this idea. And I think Jason Reed actually does a good job of addressing some of these objections. So let's see what else he has to say.
I mean, what the problem with that is that you exist and I exist, and the world in which we live exists.
Fair
And so
enough.
you so what I was going to say originally was, so maybe you're going for some sort of idealism or something. There's God and God's mind, and there's a whole lot of stuff happening in God's mind, and that's what we are, right? We're just ideas or imaginings or something like that in the mind of God.
So again, I guess just to be clear, so if we're going off of the question that was asked earlier, he says, Jason Reed, he said, well, there's only God. There's just the mind of God, or that's it. So that's more like existence monism, as we've talked about before, which is this, you know what, let me just do this actually. Let me bring up a little visualization for you guys. I'm going to share this image here. So this idea that there's only God, or that there's only the fundamental mind, whatever, would be the option here on the left. So this perspective can mean a few things. Either it means you, me, the universe, objects aren't real, and there's only God, or that one mind, or perhaps we're all identical. You, me, objects, everything, we're all indistinguishable, and we are all identical to the one. It's a very radical version. It's not widely used, but it's an option. My version is more on the right, as you can even see by my profile picture. It looks more like this. It's this idea that there is the one, the fundamental mind, but subsumed within this mind are these other subjects, other minds. And they're not just ideas in the mind. It's better, I think it's more appropriate to say they're experience. And of course, well, there are subjects that have experiences, but the universe is an experience in the mind of God. It's not an idea. And it might seem like nitpicking, but an idea is just something you think about. It's just an idea. But an experience is something you actually are acquainted with. You can feel pain. You don't just think about pain, you experience pain. So I guess we can get back to that video. So I just wanted to make that a little bit more clear for the audience here, that that's kind of what he's getting at there, that the questioner, at least, that's the kind of idealism he's talking about, that there's just the one.
That theory is still going to turn out to be more complicated than the naturalist theory that says, well, no, there's us and the world and so on, but there's no God and no divine mind.
Is
Right?
that
We'll be able to kind of pair things up in such a way that the naturalist theory will turn out to be, it'll explain everything, right? Because everything's now getting explained as in terms of stuff that's happening in God's mind, instead of being explained in terms of this existing stuff, right?
right?
The way you said that, this is kind of an old reference I'm going to make here, but if you've ever seen, what was it called? Austin Powers. There's a character, Dr. Evil. That's pretty funny. And like, I forgot what was said to him, but somebody said something to him that was incredulous. And he had the exact same response. There's even like a GIF of it where he's just like, right. This kind of like, a little skeptical of what you're saying there. And I can see why Jason Reed is having this incredulity. And he's going to explain a bit more right here. Let's see.
But I think they'd be equal then.
No, because there'll be an idea in God's mind for each bit of the universe, and we can kind of pair them up as kind of primitives in the theory. But then you've got God's mind as extras on the theist side, right? Because there's the universe and its contents, and then and you have that on both sides.
Okay.
And then there's some extra stuff on the theist side. That's how it seems to me.
And so, yeah, he's trying to say that, like, well, there's the entities themselves and there's like the ideas of the entities or something. I could be misinterpreting him, but that's what it sounds like he's saying. And as we already talked about before with Christian idealism, that's not how we look at it. That sounds much more like a sort of maybe a Platonic dualism, where there's the ideas in the Plato's heaven, the divine ideas, and then there's this additional physical, natural stuff. And the idealist isn't seeing it that way. There's just the divine mind and the experiences within the mind. And particularly with the questioner, he's just saying there's just the divine mind. That's it. And I think that's why he wants to object so much here. So let's hear him out a bit more.
Turns out to be
What's the extra stuff?
God and God's mind. There's nothing that corresponds to that.
But they're the same. They're the same thing, aren't they?
Yeah, see, he's trying to say, but no, reality just is God's mind. He's not saying there's, the natural world, and then in addition, there's this mind, this supernatural mind. No, he's saying there's just God in this view of idealism. So it's possible that Graham Oppy maybe just misheard and misunderstood or something like that. But I think Oppy is misunderstanding Jason Reed here, really, that, yeah, that's in terms of simplicity. I mean, it's hard to argue that the view that says there's only one thing, that there's just the mind, that God's mind, whatever, hard to see how that's adding more than a naturalist who would say there's lots of other different things.
God and God's mind.
So
God is.
okay, sorry, there's God, right? I mean, the idea was that we've got all this stuff happening in the divine mind. So you can think of it as there's a kind of container for the universe that the universe has been placed into by the theist, and it gets taken away by the naturalist. I mean, that's not exactly right, because I'm thinking that you and me and the world are not just ideas in a mind where we have an extra mental reality. But
yeah, and I want to be clear. Yeah, I wouldn't say we are ideas as well. That's not a perspective I would hold to.
you can still see how to pair up the ideas in the divine mind with the extra mental reality.
But you see, there you go. See, there it is. He's trying to, well, there's the divine ideas, and then there's the extra mental reality. But we don't think there is such a thing as an extra mental reality. All of reality is just mental. So there's no pairing. See, to pair suggests there's two things, and you're trying to kind of put them together, match them, align them, whatever. But again, we're talking about monism here, monistic idealism. So there's no need for any of this talk of pairing and all of that.
Leaving this remainder, which is God. The thing that's having the ideas on the theistic side.
I still have the intuition that they're on par with each other, because
Good. I'm glad that he's standing his ground. I'm glad that he's pressing him on this. He's noting that no, I think actually they are on par, and I'm inclined to agree with Reed there.
I think you're trying to wedge a gap between God's mind and God.
Well, no, maybe I was initially, but I retreated from that and said, look, let's suppose that God just is God's mind. We still have to distinguish between that and the contents, right? What's in the mind.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could say the same thing about, well, there's the universe and then the contents of the universe. So if that's how we're looking at it, well, there's just the mind and its contents, and then you could also say, well, there's the natural world and its contents. So if we look at it like that, I'm not saying how the idealist is adding anything. So notice how he keeps wanting to go there. He keeps wanting to go to this place of like, well, you guys are adding. It's just his go-to strategy. He wants to paint you as a dualist. He wants to paint you as somebody who's assuming more than him, when really, actually, we're assuming about as much as him, or as Christian idealism said, less.
And on one view, we've got the universe, and on the other side, we've got the universe in the mind. Right? I mean, speaking very loosely.
But
so there's more.
But there's no. I mean, this goes back to your identity theory of the mind. There is no difference. They're the same thing.
Exactly.
No,
They're totally different. The universe and God's mind.
The identity theory says there's no.
Oh, darn it. Sorry for the lag, bros.
No difference between that neural states and mental states are one and the same, right? Perceiving is stuff happening in your brain, and conceiving is stuff happening in your brain, and emoting is perhaps a combination of stuff happening in your brain and stuff happening to certain parts of your body, and so on.
But remember, so the idealist, if they want to, they could have a very similar position, but just in reverse, where instead of saying, well, the mind is just a neural state, you say, well, the neural state is nothing more than just the mind. You just go the other direction. And so you can have an idealist version of identity theory. And that's what Jason Reed is getting at here, that you can have that. And I think Graham Oppy is, because he's just not used to seeing that. Idealism is such a minority view. You don't really see this stuff. And there's so many different versions of idealism. Not all idealists talk in this way. But I just think he's not really prepared to handle that version of idealism, because it has a lot of the same advantages that he has. Very monistic, parsimony. And when you're dealing with another option that is just as parsimonious, or even less, or even more parsimonious, as Christian would argue, I just don't think he has anywhere to go. I don't think he has many more arguments from there. At least just from what I've seen. He may have lots of other stuff that he has elsewhere. But based off the paper and the clip that we're seeing, I don't think he has much else.
Identity theory isn't a view that says that that there's no distinction between perceivings or believings and the brain. Right? It's just that perceivings and believings are either states of the brain or processes in the brain or occurrences in the brain or whatever, however you want the ontology to play out. And on the theory that you were describing,
Sorry, I was having a little bit of lag here.
we have God, the mind, and
Not quite sure
then
what's
we
going
have
on here.
thoughts in the mind of God. And the thoughts are not to be identified with the mind. Right? They're contents of the mind or states of the mind.
Yeah, so that sounds like a point I've already addressed as well. He just kind of repeats that point about
Processes in the
mind and its content.
Occurrences in the mind or whatever. Again, it doesn't matter how you make the ontology play out.
And so perhaps Reed's going to respond to that from there.
I think.
Okay.
Well, the lag is getting pretty brutal, but he may not even have a whole lot more to say. So it seems like he's going to keep pushing. I'm glad that he's doing this. He's just going off of memory.
Sounds a little bit like there's God, and then you have it that there's God, and then there's God's thoughts, and that's what God is. Whereas
on this picture.
Okay. Well, you know what? Maybe what I'll do is I'll just kind of back it up from here, because I think maybe we might just be repeating ourselves at this point. So basically, yeah, I think to just drive home the point more clearly, though it's already been said before, I think Graham Oppy thinks idealism is dualistic in many ways. I think he misunderstands it. He wants to inflate it. He wants to talk about it like, well, you would have to have a supernatural mind. You'd have to have this extra mind, this extra thing. But he's not realizing that even the materialist is actually going to say, well, something's fundamental and it's irreducible. If you think it's the cosmos, the physical cosmos, well, then that's your fundamental thing. But if you're an idealist, you can say, no, it's not that. It's just the mind, or it's a fundamental mind. And remember, here's another thing to consider too. Most materialists, a lot of them in my experience, are very atomistic and pluralistic. So they think what's fundamental are these particles, these little bits of matter. And there's potentially infinite of them. Who knows? There could be trillions or billions, or it goes on and on and on. So think about it like this. The materialist has potentially infinite number of entities as fundamental. The monistic idealist says only one entity is fundamental, which is this fundamental mind. So if we're looking at this from from simplicity standpoint, it seems to me that the idealist wins. You could apply what Jonathan Schaffer calls Occam's laser, where it's about who has the least amount of fundamental entities. And it seems like the idealist wins there. And again, if you want to go the more monistic route for physicalism and say, okay, well, it's not that there's these little particles that are fundamental. it's a physical object. Maybe it's the cosmos as a whole, or maybe it's some other physical object. Well, again, whatever the physicalist is doing there, the idealist can do as well. They can also accept priority monism. And at that point, you can't really make the argument from simplicity there. So you're going to need something more. And so I guess that's pretty much all I have for you guys tonight. I'll just take a look at some of the comments here real quick. We had Benjamin, who I just made a video with not long ago. I don't know when it'll be ready, but I recorded something with him like, was it yesterday or yeah. He said first to post. So he made it first. Right on. And we have James the Wise, who noted that Berkeley already explained that empiricism should lead one to some variation of idealism. It's common sense. Physicalism and its variants are antithetical to empiricism. That's true. I agree. I think I mean, Berkeley already explains it much better than I can. So we have James the Wise again, and he brought this up. This is an interesting idea. I might do this. He says you should interview Brenton Ram, which if you don't know about him, he's a scholar who affirms idealism and panpsychism. So he gives a defense of that view via phenomenology. And it could actually lead more people who are panpsychists towards idealism. And I agree. Even David Chalmers has noted there's definitely a pipeline from panpsychism to idealism. Just become who you are, panpsychist bros. Really, you're an idealist. And this guy's got one more comment to make here. He says, I think Whitehead's process philosophy makes a lot of sense and is a good position for any non-physicalist, especially an idealist, to take. Keith Ward explained it beautifully in his More Than Matter book. I like Keith Ward. He's awesome. I personally am not a big fan of process philosophy. I'm more into substance philosophy. And I think most people are as well. But I mean, please, by all means, if it turns out to be the better option, then let's go for it, bros. Whitehead's cool. It's perfectly compatible with idealism. So if you're more attracted to not viewing yourself as a noun, but as a verb, maybe you would like process philosophy. Maybe that's more your style. But okay. But I guess that's it for here. Just want to give a quick shout out again to Christian Idealism. Thanks to him for joining us. That was really cool. He's kind of retired from making videos, so it was really awesome for him to just join us like that and share his thoughts. And to Graham Oppy, I still respect him a lot. I obviously disagree with him about theism and, of course, idealism, but I know he's a smart guy. I think he just needs to give idealism a chance more. I think he needs to read a little bit more literature. It's not an insult to him. It's just, I think you just need to just pay attention to it a little bit more. And not calling you uncharitable, but try to read it charitably. Really try to understand idealism and the many different versions of it. There are so many different versions. And but yeah, the more popular ones are the more monistic ones. And there's a lot in common with reductive physicalism and monistic idealism in the sense that they're both monistic ontologies, and they, just as they reduce the mental to the physical, the idealist goes the other way and reduces the physical to the mental. Oh, did I mess that up? I don't know. I'm getting a little tired. But anyway, I guess that's the show from here. Thanks again to Graham Oppy and all you guys for checking it out. Appreciate it. And if you got any more comments, please feel free. So you guys all have a great night. Peace.